How can we obtain copper 2 sulfate crystals from a solution of copper 2 sulfate? From our previous class, we have learned that when sodium chloride is dissolved in water, it is known as sodium chloride solution, or a solution of sodium chloride. Now, copper 2 sulfate is another example of a salt. Now, a solution of copper 2 sulfate means that copper 2 sulfate salt has dissolved in water, which essentially means that we have both copper 2 sulfate and water in the mixture. Now, how can we obtain copper 2 sulfate crystals? One would say that we could use evaporation, but evaporation would not obtain copper 2 sulfate crystals, but it will obtain copper 2 sulfate powder. Because copper 2 sulfate crystals have what we call the water of crystallization. That is the water in the salt structure or lattice. Now, if we use evaporation method, we are going to drive out the water of crystallization and will remain with copper 2 sulfate powder. And therefore, we will need to use a different method to obtain copper 2 sulfate crystals, which we can describe using the following diagram. These diagrams represent the process in which we can use to obtain copper 2 sulfate crystals. You will set up the apparatus as shown in this first diagram here. You begin heating copper 2 sulfate solution in an evaporating dish until it starts to form crystals. Now, how will you know that it has started to form crystals? You would take a glass rod and dip it in the evaporating dish and remove it and leave it in the air and see if any crystals have started forming. The moment crystals start to form, we call that saturated or saturation point. And it would mean that this copper 2 sulfate solution is now saturated. A saturated solution is a solution in which normal solute can dissolve at a given temperature. After we reach saturation point, we shift to this next diagram and we stop heating. And allow the solution to cool. You may notice that crystals of copper 2 sulfate will start to form in the evaporating dish as the solution cools down. In the end, we'll form big crystals of copper 2 sulfate, and then we will pour out the remaining solution, which is known as mother liquor. And remain with crystals of copper 2 sulfate. We can dry the crystals between filter papers, and we will have obtained copper 2 sulfate crystals from a solution of copper 2 sulfate. This picture here shows us an example of copper 2 sulfate crystals that have been obtained using crystallization process.